Today we are going to talk about. Uh, Today we're talking about program management. Programs are, of course, the sort of central piece of the work that you're doing in the different sectors of your organizations. I always refer to this as saving the puppies and saving the whales, and so that's why um, you see puppies and whales on this screen. I guess if you have to explain it, it's not a good intro screen. But anyways, programs can be challenging when you're just starting out or when you're small because you don't have all the resources that you want to have. You don't necessarily have the track record or really the understanding of what works and what doesn't. So there's some disadvantages to kind of starting out small and starting out from scratch. There's also some advantages to being in that position that we'll talk about. We are going to start off talking about kind of, thinking about programs generally. All of you are in slightly different mission areas, so it's hard to be kind of comprehensive about, what a good program looks like everywhere. So I'm going to try to wrap this presentation up a little earlier so that we have time if you've got specific program ideas or program questions that you want to bounce off of everyone, myself included, that we can kind of help you think through that. So if you haven't joined us before for one of these webinars, my name is Hampton. I'm the creator of Tiny Opera House. I'm also a recurring nonprofit founder and director myself. I've had to do a number of programs where, we went dumpster diving for materials and built furniture ourselves, and really had to think about how to be scrappy and impactful at the same time. So I'm happy to share some of that experience with you. Also, as I've progressed in my career, seeing how this works at higher levels and more sophisticated organizations has kind of helped inform, if I were to do that again, kind of what my approach would be. Most of my background is in arts organizations, also some social justice and housing. So I'm excited to share sort of my experiences and also what I've learned about best practices from working with organizations of all sizes. So high impact is sort of the name of the game for me in thinking about programs for small organizations. When you don't have the resources to have this sort of broad reach, or it's really kind of long thinking that you want to have as an organization, I think the focus is on how to make the programs that you do have as valuable as they can be to the audiences you're working with. Programs, of course, these are, I use programs as a term to define the things you're doing to achieve your mission, right? So we've talked mostly in this webinar series about operational items and kind of running the business part of nonprofit organizations. Here we're going to talk about the mission work and how we can improve and also measure and kind of evaluate to see if what we're doing is working. You can have multiple programs achieving different parts of your mission, right? You can have one program that does everything in your mission. We'll talk as we go through this how all of this relates back to what we talked about in the very first webinar about really distilling and being specific about what your mission is and what you're trying to achieve. As you're doing that, we talked about this idea of a mission matrix where you've got kind of the different, a box that shows the different parts of your mission. Taking that a step forward, looking at what your mission is and evaluating how can we have a program that addresses each one of these mission areas. When you're just starting out, some parts of your mission may not have any programs yet. You might not have figured out or have gotten around to addressing all of the parts of your mission, or you may have more long-term goals where, in a couple of years, you'd like to be, offering rental assistance to folks who are transitioning out of government housing or something like that. But in the beginning, you might have to start kind of scale back and working up to that. But of course, your goal is, to be addressing each part of your mission with some sort of program that helps you achieve your outcomes that you're looking to achieve in your target population. Again, it's hard to talk about programs for everyone because I know we're all in slightly different industries, but there's a few things that I always think about when either designing a program or evaluating a program that I'm part of. And a couple of these, I always think in terms of adjectives. So a couple of adjectives that I think are helpful in thinking about what makes a high impact program. For me, the most important part of this is authenticity. We'll talk a little bit about how this is actually a leverage point that you have as a small organization. Authenticity to me means programs that are genuine, that are actually trying to address real specific problems that have something that you can do and that your audience can do to improve parts of those problems. And authenticity also to me means that you're thinking about this in a comprehensive way, right? So if you are trying to do a program that does save the whales or save the puppies, and you don't really have any experience with whales or puppies or really any sort of plan for how you're going to take money and save whales, that starts to be a really inauthentic approach. Whereas if you are someone who's got a background in marine biology and know a way to really do this, that's how you build authenticity, and that's how you build credibility with donors and your partners and folks who are helping you do this work. I think the term holistic to me really is in line with an authentic program. A lot of these programs are working in a really complicated, and to have an authentic program, I think you need a holistic understanding of what's happening, what's causing this problem, how it's relative in your community versus other communities, and how you can start to unpack what are things you can do to start to solve this or to start to address this problem, is what makes a program authentic. Another adjective I think about is specific. So a specific program to me is one that addresses a specific need, so something that's focused. A lot of our missions are really big, complicated problems. So, if we're working in education in, a certain neighborhood, or if we're working in immigration, even working in, animal rescues or rehabilitation, we're only a few steps away from, really seeing that our problems that we're working on are systemic. So they're like systematic problems. So big, complicated kind of policy issues ultimately are part of addressing this. But to me, a high impact program is something that takes a broader, more complicated problem and finds a specific thing that we can do, that our partners can do, that the folks who are, in our organizational family can do, to start to work on this, right? You can never solve a systematic problem, if you work on the problem as a whole. So to be high impact, breaking that down into something that's specific, so it's something that we can achieve. It's also really important in terms of communication, right? So if you are communicating what you're doing and what, why your organization has value, it helps to be really specific, because then people can understand it. If it takes you more than a sentence to explain the work that you're doing and have somebody say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Maybe you're approaching this in too broad of a manner. So specific to me is part of what makes a program effective and have that sort of high impact level. I also think about programs as being engaging. And to me, I'm using this term as it's something that you can engage your stakeholders around, where they can see themselves in the work that you're doing and see how what they're contributing to the organization is helping achieve that mission. So it's hard to engage people around concepts. So it's hard to engage people around climate change. I mean, climate change, like we all kind of just feel bad about, or if we're talking about poverty alleviation, those things are big and complicated, and it's hard to really see how I as a potential donor or potential stakeholder who comes to an event, it's hard for me to see how my actions are going to have any impact in that area. So when thinking about how to structure programs, I think it's important to think in the mind of your supporters, how are they going to see themselves in the work, and how are they going to say, okay, I can understand how I'm making a difference in this area through being part of this organization. And these kind of all kind of go together. Engaging programs need to have something specific to engage an audience around, right? So they can understand it, they can see how what they're doing is important in the work. I think another part of this, I think about questions to ask yourself when either looking at a program that you're already doing or thinking about how to add a program to your portfolio of activities that you're using to address your mission. I think credibility is a big thing to consider. I think credibility and authenticity are really related. I think it's much easier to engage an audience or your stakeholders around something that you have credibility to work on. This can be either geographic credibility, it can be educational, like, if you actually have a degree in understanding, environmental relations, that gives you some credibility. It can also be demographic. I mean, I personally am a 6'3" white guy from the South. So there's certain things that I might not have the credibility to really be working on. Credibility helps you skip over some of the questions around why are you the right person to do this work. And when you're small and when you're just getting started, you want to limit those questions that an audience might have or a donor might have, so that you kind of create a thought line from their perspective on why all of this makes sense, right? So that the programs make sense, the mission and the activities make sense, the fact that you're the one doing this work makes sense. So I think credibility is really important. There are ways that you can enhance your credibility. If it's something that you don't have personal credibility in, maybe you have a board member that does have that deep educational background or deep policy background, or the credibility within neighborhoods. If you're looking kind of community specific where you're working, are there people you can engage to be part of your team that give you that credibility if you don't have it on your own? Does that make sense? I think this one's really important, and I think it will save you a lot of time and also help you think through where you want to focus your energy, because it's hard to, it's harder to do work in areas that you or your team don't have the kind of credibility weight to work in. This is also kind of related to that. The people who are on your team can give you credibility. The people on your team also have different skill sets to execute programs. If you're doing a music festival, having people involved who understand the artistic community, or the folks who have the speakers and the PAs and things that you can rent and borrow. Sometimes this is a step, backwards, where you think about, here's a work, some work that I want to do. Now let me step back a little bit and make sure that I have the right people involved to actually accomplish that goal, and then maybe taking a step back and building the team and then being able to move forward. It's hard to do all of this, on your own as an individual person. I'm sure everyone has had that experience and is maybe even having it right now. So looking at programs in terms of making sure that you have the right people engaged, and if you don't, making sure that you spend the time to get those folks engaged to do the work that you want to. There's a lot of duplication in our efforts in the nonprofit industry. I personally think that duplication is a really good thing, because I think problems are really complicated and we need a whole bunch of people working in slightly different solutions to solve these big systemic problems. But it's also important to think about what is unique about you and your team and your program that can give you an advantage in talking to donors or talking to stakeholders. If there are I'm in San Diego, where homelessness is a big problem. There are 20 or 30, maybe 50 organizations working on homelessness, and all kind of in slightly different areas. It's almost like finding your market niche. What is it unique about you, your experience, your creativity, your passions, that can add something important and specific to contribute to the conversation about solving some of these problems. Again, focusing on where you're uniquely adding value, just like where you're uniquely credible to be working on an issue, saves you a lot of time and saves you a lot of questions. That you don't have to answer in the minds of donors and stakeholders. That kind of building something that makes sense. Just like in that, the idea of duplication, who else is doing this work in my community? You are rarely going to be the only one working on something where you are. So finding out who is doing similar work and having a conversation, either for future partnerships or to understand how you can add a unique value to the conversation, or where you have unique credibility to work on a specific part of the mission. And this is almost just like a Google game. Homelessness in San Diego, that will help lead me to organizations doing this work, that can be part of the conversation and can be resources for you too. When you're at a small level, you are very far away from really needing to worry about protecting your kind of resource set, or your group of donors, or your group of followers or members. You kind of don't have to worry about that yet, because no one's really getting rich at this at this point of the game. We're all just trying to do something that's important. So finding other organizations or other humans who are engaged in this work is important. And again, it's going to save you a lot of time and help you build a more authentic program, because these are other questions that, if you've thought about them in advance, stakeholders, donors, audience members are not going to have these questions to think about. And then reality. I mean, if your goal is to, alleviate or help with education in Africa, maybe sending every kid to school there as your goal is not really going to be that effective. Sometimes you may have something big that you want to pull off, that you have to think about, is this something I do in 3 years? Is this something I do in 5 years? And then work backwards to think, what can I do today that puts me on a path to achieving these kind of big goals that you have? Because at this point, I think everyone on this call, is dealing with limited resources, both in, financially, both in time, both in talent, and folks who are engaged on the board and volunteers. So it's much more important to be successful at this stage than it is to be aspirational, I think. You need successes to build on, so that you can start going in the direction of having these bigger ambitions. But if you try to do too much right from the beginning, you're not going to have that track record of success and that audience development and donor development that comes from being able to show that you're actually capable of pulling off some of these program things. So being realistic with yourself and your team and your resources and the folks who are helping you. I don't think there's no, in terms of execution, there's no real value in thinking too big. I think it's much more important to do something that you can achieve, and then build on, so that you can reach some of these more long-term goals that you have. This is something that, when I think about building a program, I think about it in terms of everything kind of building concentrically around a common idea. I think this is a way to stay focused. I think this is a way to build something that feels authentic in your program. And so I made some circles so that I can explain what I kind of think about in this. So starting with always, and this is, what I've said, from the beginning, always starting with strategy, always starting with the goal, always starting with the most distilled, focused mission statement that you have. In terms of a program, what's the point? What are we trying to do with this program? And then everything else can build from there. Every other decision about program development, whether it's how you talk about it, how you message it, who you're talking about it to. If your point is you are trying to get more elementary school kids to attend events in a local park, that goal is going to drive how you talk about the event. It's going to drive who you talk about that event to. Same thing, even from there, where you host programs, who you're working with to achieve these goals. This is, if you're working with kids in a disadvantaged neighborhood, going after a sponsorship from Lamborghini probably doesn't make a lot of sense, and is also going to make it so that people who are thinking about your program have questions about credibility and the authenticity of what you're working on. So everything needs to relate back to what the central distilled point of a program is, even down to your CTA, which is the acronym for call to action. So if you're talking about how you can send a kid to summer camp for $300 and your follow-up is asking for $100,000 from somebody, that doesn't fit with what the central point of the program is. So I always think about this, and every time I am making a decision about a program, I really am methodical about going back and thinking about what is the point of this program, and that really helps you make decisions and helps drive the direction that you're going in. Some of this too, you may have heard the phrase, creativity needs a box. Sometimes. When you're focused, it gives you kind of boundaries around what you're capable of doing or what makes sense for you to be doing. And this kind of concentric thinking is a little bit like building some boundaries so that it'll be easier for you to think, who's going to be a good sponsor target for this program? Who's going to be good individual donor targets for this program? Who are partners that make sense for this? If you are relating everything back to the distilled tight focus of what you're trying to achieve, it's easier to figure those things out because you've got a little bit of a boundary, a little bit of a box that you're building for yourself, which is helpful because when you're doing this and when you're creating an organization on your own, you've got sort of an infinite number of things you could do, and sometimes it's overwhelming the amount of options that you have. So anytime that you can kind of constrain yourself and help yourself focus, I think is going to make you more impactful and also save some of your sanity as well. Again, everything starts with strategy, that sort of core focus. It's my favorite thing to say. I've been saying it, I think, every single webinar I say it at some point. But that's why, it's really important to figure out, very specifically, what are you trying to achieve? How are you going to achieve it? And, programs kind of build from there. Some other thoughts about programming that I didn't really know how to fit up earlier. I think it's really important, again, when you are small and when you are just getting started, to think about something you can achieve, something you can be authentic, something where you can build credibility and build your brand and build your donor base. And a lot of that's starting with something small. Before you can help 1,000 people, of course, you have to help one person. So trying to get, kind of run before you walk almost, it's going to make you frustrated. It's going to make you, not feel successful. It's much better, I think, when you're just getting going, to think about the flip side. How do we help 10 people? Let's start with 10. Let's start with one. I mean, helping one person as an organization is huge. That is achieving the mission. Even if you only are helping one person, even if you send only one kid to summer camp, like, that's still a big difference to that kid. There's no failure in helping a smaller amount than you want to. And again, then it's much easier to build on one than it is to build on zero. I do want to talk a little bit about ways that it's to your advantage to be small. I think as a small organization, and as what I imagine, most of the founders and most of the directors I work with of small organizations, they've got the authenticity and they've got the credibility already. And that's how they came to see themselves in doing this work, and came to see themselves as the ones uniquely qualified to achieve the mission they're working on. So I think for a lot of you, that's a big advantage, because, some, MBA from Harvard who comes in to run a big organization that doesn't really know the community, doesn't really know what is happening kind of on the grassroots, like close to the bone, directly mission near that all of us are working in. We can create a narrative around authenticity that a lot of organizations can't. So I think that's something really important to remember, as you're thinking about your messaging, as you're thinking about how you're talking about yourself and the work that you're doing, that you have likely got more authenticity, and especially if you can be, really specific about the mission that you're trying to work in. You could do an event that just raises money for one kid, and that's a great story. And that gets people really excited and helps them understand, oh, I understand this bigger problem because I can see it through the eyes of helping this person whose name is Susan and likes horseback riding and wants to grow up to be a doctor. Like that narrative you can build with tight focus, tight specificity, and leaning into your authenticity to do this work is something that a lot of organizations don't have. Again, maybe it's maybe not as sexy because you're not going to send 10,000 kids to school, but um, you've got the ability to do more with less and do more in a more authentic way than organizations who have to spend a lot of time and have to spend a lot of fundraising on electric bills and insurance and pensions for people who don't work there anymore. So I, if you can tell, I get really excited about that, and I think that's why I like working in this part of the universe, is because you can have such a good, authentic, important, valuable, high narrative impact, for a lot less money than it costs to keep the lights on at a big empty building. Okay. Um, in terms of thinking about new programs or thinking about new ways to address some of these challenges, this gets back into the idea of the innovation cycle. And we've talked about this a number of times. This, if you don't know what works yet because it's your first or your second program, the idea that you're trying something, you're measuring what works, see what happens after you do something, adjusting so that next time you do it, you do a little bit better every time, and then repeating it. That's the cycle of how you get better at executing the work, how you get better at impacting the population that you are looking to make a difference in. And also how you figure out, which program ideas work and which ones are valuable, which ones are worth repeating. I think it's also helpful to just steal ideas from other people, right? None of us are working in a vacuum. Homelessness is not a unique problem in San Diego. It's a problem everywhere, and has been, maybe not everywhere, lots of places, and has been a problem for a long time. So there are people that have all kinds of great ideas and great solutions to this. I worked with a woman last week who, it's important to her to provide menstrual pads and tampons to homeless women. Like, that's a great narrative. That's a great impact to those human beings who are getting that service from her. She maybe didn't come up with that idea by herself. It's not a unique problem. Our problems are relatable. Our problems are systemic. They're kind of everywhere. So I think there's a lot that you can get from seeing what other people are doing that is working well, that resonates with you, and you do that by researching or by being part of newsletters and groups where they talk about this type of work. I always found that it was helpful to travel to other cities and as much as I could and see what they were doing. When I was doing art work, art programming in the Tampa Bay area, there was a big art festival every year in Miami that I would go to, and I would just kind of rip off ideas from there. And rip off is a little bit too, maybe too dry, but of a term. But bringing those ideas to my community helped achieve the mission that I was trying to achieve, and I got to sort of be smarter than than I really was. I couldn't come up with those ideas, but you could see what's working well, see what other people are doing that's getting traction, and adapting that to your market. I think there's Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. Is that what people say? I think someone said that. Maybe. Okay. It's also important to realize that these things take time, especially if you're engaging the public in this work. Then you need to think about, press release timing, marketing timing. How long does it take to sort of, do an awareness campaign so people even realize that you're doing this? I think, just making sure that you give yourself enough time to do this. I mean, starting with what you want to achieve as a program and working backwards. How long is it going to take to build that audience so that you can attract people to this kind of work? It always takes more time than you think. At least I always found it. It always takes more time. I think that also really being cognizant of the fact that you've got multiple stakeholder groups in any work that you're doing. This is something we talked about in the first session around strategic planning, where you've got donor stakeholders and you've got the beneficiaries of your mission work, and those are not always the same people. Where you get your money and what the population you spend it on are rarely the same, but both need to be engaged through programs in some way. So, thinking about how many stakeholders can we engage in the work that we're doing at one time, so that if you are engaging a couple of these at once, then it saves you time versus having to do a program for each one of these. This can be hard in really highly social service agencies. I've worked with groups that deal with women who are leaving abusive relationships, or victims of human trafficking, men and women. There's a lot of privacy concerns in that type of work. You can't really take a picture of a person who's dealing with that and put it on Facebook and help promote them as a way to talk about your mission. So sometimes this is really tricky, and so sometimes you have to have multiple different programs that are part of this, so that you can engage all these stakeholder groups. But I think it is really important, especially the public. I think some way that normal people can engage with this is important, not only in spreading the word and the mission that you have, but also as that really top broad part of the funnel. Right? When we talk about sales and we talk about fundraising, somebody who's never heard of you and has never given you any money needs to have a way to engage with you for the first time, so that they can then be part of, recurring emails and follow-ups, and then maybe get them to a point where they're donating. The media as well. It's, we've got great stories to tell, at this level with the work that we're doing. So, I think that's important to just be cognizant of. There's a lot of people that you need to engage, not just the puppies or the whales or whatever you're working on, but everyone else who can be a stakeholder in the work you're doing. Last, I want to emphasize the idea of partnerships as a way to kind of go farther than you could do on your own. There are undoubtedly at least a couple other people or a couple other groups in all of your communities that are doing similar work. I think at this stage, being protective of resources is sort of to your own detriment, because you can build a great program that then gets your name out there and your name associated with something highly credible and highly authentic, by bringing together other people that have that same authenticity. So I think this is not something you should try to do on your own right from the beginning. Until you've got that track record of execution and being able to produce something valuable. I think partnering with other organizations in similar positions with, a little more success than you makes you have a higher likelihood of being successful in that work. So don't be scared of partnering with other people. You could look like a genius and a great program designer just by bringing other people together to do something at the same time, and then you get all this brand credibility and brand weight from being the person who pulled this off, when you kind of just brought other people to the table. I mean, that's a huge it's a huge thing, and it's a good use of time too. Okay, any questions on that kind of program stuff generally in Google or in Zoom? Okay, I don't see any. The other thing to think about, and this is something that when I was doing my first programming, it never occurred to me to do, and I lost a lot of ground and a lot of momentum because I wasn't doing this from the beginning. So I think it's really important to think about, not only how do we execute this work and do something important, but how do we measure this? And it's sort of a little bit of a mystery to some degree because, you can't put a price on the life of a child, but, kind of you have to because, we operate in the real world and we have to make decisions about things. So it's not a perfect science thinking about how to measure the effectiveness and impact of your programs. But I do want to talk about it because I think it's important for this to become part of how you think about programming. It is, this second part of that innovation cycle concept where you're, trying something out, you're measuring as much as you can so that you have information to determine, is this a good use of time? Did I achieve what I was trying to achieve? How can I make it better? So this idea of impact measurement is really important. I'll do a little bit of a soapbox because I haven't done one in a while about how impact measurement works right now in the nonprofit sector. Metrics are kind of made up at this point, and they have been for a really long time. They're mostly made up because it's difficult to verify these numbers. It's difficult to verify that, you could give one child a book at the right time that then makes them found Google and be a bajillionaire and make the world better, right? But you can never tell exactly when that is or exactly what book at what time, what child. So it's hard to verify any of these numbers. There's a lack of comparability between organizations, right? Doing something important for this child, you do the same thing for a different child and it could do nothing. It could be completely irrelevant. Most of the venue for communication about metrics of programs is in marketing documents, right? So organizations put this out in their annual, plan. We, saved 65 bajillion kids from going hungry. Those are not real numbers. Those are kind of made up. They're kind of just marketing numbers. And they're also used in grant applications when you're talking about how big and how impactful. There's no way to really verify the numbers. My favorite story I tell all the time, I was running a county arts council in Florida, and those organizations get money from the state. I lost grant money to a county that claimed that they were directly impacting a population bigger than the entire county in art, which is kind of it's just not true. But on the call, everyone's like, ooh, that sounds like a big number. And they won all the money. So, there's a huge interest in the sector on figuring out how to do this metrics thing better. But right now, it's still a little bit of the Wild West. So we'll talk about some strategies that you can have to measure things so that as this is evolving and becoming more of a science, that you're prepared for it. But knowing right now that this is not a perfect science and there is a lot of, kind of Wild West feel to this area. Only recently has anyone really tried to standardize this. There was some movement around this thing called the overhead ratio that we can have a whole other soapbox around if you want, but ways to standardize and measure and compare organizations is kind of top of mind for a lot of folks, but until recently, no one's really made any progress with. And part of that is because you've got a couple different things you can work with. I call them, you've got real numbers and you also got kind of enhanced numbers that have something else added to them. A real number would be, something that's countable, something that's really, proven. This is more of the, something you can verify. This would be something like event attendance, right? If you're selling tickets to an event, that 213 people came. That's great. That's a real number and you can show documentation for that. If you have saved, 10 puppies from being, put down and found them homes, those are real numbers you can measure. A lot of this is financial. We talked about this in terms of our financial systems planning. Financial metrics are kind of the best ones that we have because everyone has a bank account at the end of the day, and everyone, is the ability to communicate, with the IRS and with their boards in terms of what the financials are. So, you spent $10,000 on a program or you raised $5,000. That's a real thing that's verifiable. But then we also have this whole idea about enhanced numbers. So these are kind of real numbers that organizations either use estimates or use multipliers to kind of make them the goal is to make them more accurate, because $10,000 has more of an impact than just the $10,000 that you spend. So uh, the intention is good on this, but there's a lot of ways that you can kind of augment this in a way that is not being authentic to your narrative. So something like awareness. I've seen organizations who paid for a billboard and then claimed that they had their awareness campaign reached every single person that drove by that billboard. And they do, highway institutes will do estimates of the number of humans that drive by certain areas. So that's, something that's kind of a number, but kind of, not a real number. Economic impact is, people love to use this one, and there's a lot of different multipliers that are used. So basically, people measure economic impact by having a really big sciencey research project that says for every $1 we spend on education, we create $6.2 of economic impact. And those numbers can be really great and can really make it you seem like you're doing a bigger job. But again, are kind of made up, because it's estimates and multipliers that come up with these numbers. For folks that are doing programming work, hotel nights was always a big one. If you're getting money from the tourism council, they want to know how many people are staying in hotels and paying hotels tax. The cool term for this is always heads in beds. Organizations that have bigger staff tend to be a lot better at using enhancements to their numbers to show a broader impact than organizations who are kind of starting out. There is a very academic approach to knowing what these numbers even are. So I do want to talk just a couple strategies for organizations of our sizes and of our impact. This is something I've said before. I think the best approach in general to this is to just document everything. You don't always know what numbers are going to be useful or be valuable in arguments, in grant applications and in sponsorship, requests. You don't always know that, there's people that want to look at the economic value of, anti-human trafficking organizations. And so now I wish I would have kept track of all those numbers that I wasn't really thinking about. There's not a ton. There's not an infinite number of numbers that we can generate. So I think, building a list of everything you can think to measure. So, if you are an organization working in human trafficking, certainly the number of people you're serving, the number of dollars that you spend on that, the number of, dollars you spend on housing, the number of, how much you spend on food, how much money you can raise from, different events. Just kind of making yourself a spreadsheet. This is how I would do it if I was creating a new program now. I would, think about that, all the numbers that I can think to measure, and then just kind of fill it in, at the end of a program when you're doing your evaluation, you're documenting as much as possible about what happened. And then the use of those numbers will kind of come up later as you're, in different situations or applying for different funding, talking to different, potential supporters. But the worst thing that can happen is, you go through 6 months of great programs and you don't measure anything. And then you find out a grant application is due next week and they want to know, how many people you reach through awareness campaigns, and you forgot to write that down for months. So it's a best practice to just get into, always just kind of documenting whatever you can. Financial numbers at this point are some of the most communicable of these metrics. So using a financial management system that makes it easy to track these things. This is something that, as we were building the Tiny Opera House platform, was kind of central in our approach to it, so that organizations and nonprofits who are using that can see their financials by program or by grant or by time and by donor in all kinds of different ways. Again, because you don't always know in advance how you're going to need to present information. So having a system that is flexible and understands what nonprofits go through is really important. This is also an area where you can, kind of steal ideas from other people. Again, what are other organizations doing when they talk about their work? If you've got mission alignment a little bit with a United Way program, how are they talking about it on their website? What kind of numbers do they use? Larger organizations are more in competition with each other to kind of do a standardization thing. The United Way and the Red Cross are probably reporting information kind of in the same way. So those are going to be good guides for how you, as a small organization, should be thinking about the measurement of the work you're doing. Especially in the notes, any of these things, like any of these research studies, or if the United Way says, we helped, 2,000, 2,500 people this month. There's always going to be a little footnote there that explains how they came up with that number. So those are good ways to kind of mine for these standard metrics or these standard multipliers that they use, because they'll always disclose how they came up with the numbers. Sometimes you just have to kind of read the technical footnotes to figure it out. Thinking about who you're ultimately communicating to and what's important to them, right? So if you are getting money from the Chamber of Commerce, they want to know how many businesses are coming to town, or what sort of economic impact you're having. If you are, like the earlier example, communicating and getting funding from the tourism board, they care about heads and beds and the number of hotel nights that people have. So the people who you're trying to get support for will also kind of drive how you think about reporting on the program work that you're doing. I think sometimes too, it's helpful to start with the story. So even starting with the narrative, if you were going to explain in a best case way to a potential funder what impact the work you're having, what impact you're having with your work, sometimes it's helpful to start with that narrative, like imagining kind of a story you would tell to somebody, to say, we've had X amount of people come to events, and we've supported, this amount of kids in going to after school programs. Thinking about how you would explain it and using, variables, or using X, or saying, we've helped X number of people, can sometimes be helpful, because then you can work backwards and figure out, okay, so how do I actually figure out, how much money we brought into this neighborhood on a Thursday night? If that's part of a story I want to tell, how can I use the story first and then work backwards and figure out, what's the number that I need to be measuring, and what kind of systems do I need to be putting in place to track that? You can learn a lot from Googling too. Googling and seeing how other people are doing this, seeing what metrics they use. I just did a report for an organization that was trying to value their volunteer base, and there's a think tank that puts out an estimate of the per hour, dollars per hour impact of volunteers. And so, I found that as a resource, and then was able to, take the number of volunteers and the hours and multiply by that, and say our volunteers had a, whatever it was, $25,000 impact. So you can learn a lot from just Googling this, being intentional about what you're looking for. There's a ton of stuff out there, and a ton of kind of standard metrics and things that people use in different industries. So if you're looking for it, you can find it, but it's, kind of about knowing what you're looking for. Okay, any questions on that? That's kind of the metric side of things. And there's another part of this, which is the evaluation of how the programs are impacting the populations that you want to have the impact on. So kind of in our earlier example, we gave out 10,000 books to kids in our after school program. But then what did that do to those kids, and how did it affect the outcomes of those individuals' lives? What kind of impact did we have there? And sometimes they're related, sometimes there's overlap in those metrics. Program evaluation is more of an internal tool. I think metrics are of course they are helpful to see, if you're making changes to a program, what the effects are. You can see a lot of that in the metrics. Program evaluation is more for you to understand, is the work I'm doing having the impact that I want it to have on the people or whales or puppies that I want to have it on. We're not going to talk too much about this because it's very industry specific, very mission area specific. But they are kind of two sides of the same conversation, two sides of the measurement uh, activity of the organization. Part of its metrics and part of its evaluation. There's a cool term that people use for this, and it's fun to say at board meetings, and because it sounds smart, because they both start with O, and people like alliteration. Outputs are metrics. $10,000 spent, 500 books given out, 622 hours of volunteer time spent. And outcomes is, what did that do? What did the $10,000 you spent do? What do those books actually do to the people in the population that you were trying to achieve? You could drop off 10,000 books at a school that just sit in a warehouse or closet somewhere. So outputs versus outcomes is sometimes helpful too in board meetings to redirect the conversation to like what's really important. And again, people like alliteration, so it's helpful. So yeah, are your programs having what you want to have as your impact? Are they having that impact on the population you're working on? Um, but most of this, how it's accomplished, and there are lots of consultants out there who charge a lot of money for doing program evaluation. A lot of it is just surveys, which sounds sort of trite, but actually creating a position for dialogue and feedback with and from the populations you're working on is most of how program evaluation works. And I'll give you some resources for that. This is, I guess I could put this slide anywhere, but the seeking feedback from people that you're trying to help or from populations you're working on uh, is really important to make sure that you continue to be better and evolve in the community. There's a great story of an organization in where I live in San Diego that was created to sort of do neighborhood development in what was a historically black neighborhood in Southeast San Diego. And they brought in all these people, and they were, had this sort of really complicated outreach to the black community, and trying to understand and having challenges with the power structures and the different dynamics. And they worked on this for 10 years. And at the end of the 10 years, it was a Filipino neighborhood because demographics changed, and more people moved in, who were from a different background, and their mission of an organization was community development, and they missed the idea that their community was changing. And a lot of that is because they weren't having this sort of feedback conversation with the population and with their sort of target that they're working towards. So just like the metrics measurement, documenting everything, figuring out ways to regularly create touch points with the actual program beneficiaries of your work, I think is really important. But again, it's very industry specific, and how the questions are structured. There's a lot of science in that, and statisticians and behavioral economics people pay a lot of attention to the wording of questions and the wording of things in surveys. So there's a lot out there because it is fairly academic. There's a lot of research stuff out there that you can find. I was impressed with a website called performwell.org because it provided survey frameworks in a variety of very targeted mission areas. So you could pick, social service, social justice, immigrant advocacy, and then it would give you examples of surveys that worked for that specific population. So I thought that was really good. If you're in an area in a bigger sort of MSA city area, you probably have a nonprofit advocacy group or some sort of nonprofit association. those types of groups tend to do a lot of writing about program evaluation because it's I'll talk about the next one. This is my last little soapbox for the day. We'll also talk next week. Next week we're talking about technology and using technology to be more effective and to get more done. There's a lot of great online survey tools that can help you have this conversation. It doesn't have to be pieces of paper that you print out and people fill out and hand them back. There's a lot of great free tools out there to help you do these surveys. In any of this, and this is the soapbox part, any of this evaluation research, it's important to keep in mind that it is a very academic pursuit, both the evaluation piece and the metrics piece, which tends to value somebody that's got a PhD and has spent a lot of time thinking about this and has the statistical research background to really identify the variables and the differentials and things like that. Those tend to not be the same people that have the experience actually being on the ground like us, who are in these sort of really mission near programming situations. So just keep that in mind, that even especially for through a nonprofit association, these are people that have the luxury of getting to sit around and think about this and write papers that are really complicated. So sometimes they can go down an academic pursuit that you think about and say, okay, well, that doesn't make any sense or have any validity in the work I'm doing, which is almost direct service to the people that are important to me and the populations that are important to me. So it's good on one hand because there's a lot of papers written about this. It's bad on the other hand that the people who write those papers tend to have not had the experience of actually doing the work that we are trying to do at this level of organization. I used to put soapbox in the presentation when I was going to do one, but I didn't do that this time. Surprise soapbox, I guess. Okay, some things that we can do at Tiny Opera House to help. Of course, these webinars are regular. We are going to do our own program evaluation at the end of this to send out to everyone to see how we can do this better. Particularly, I'm interested in the timing of these. Every week is kind of a lot, and I have noticed, our population has kind of dwindled as we've done this. That's why we're doing, we've got a couple of you on Zoom now to see if maybe it's a platform thing. So, anyways, look for a survey from us at some point so that we can continue to do our webinars better. If you haven't taken advantage of our office hours program, we provide free one-on-one consultations with folks who want to talk about things happening at their organizations. This can be really helpful. Sometimes it feels like you're doing this work in a vacuum, so even having a human to talk to is helpful. Again, the platform, if you don't have a way that you're measuring your finances right now, I'd love to kind of set you up with a trial of that. It makes it really easy for you to be generating and collecting this information that can be really helpful for down the road as you're growing and doing more of this work. Next week, of course, we're going to talk about website and technology. I think I said that already. And our focus there is going to be on how we can use free or cheap tools that are out there to increase the impact and the reach that we can have as organizations with limited staff time resources. There's a way to, ways to work smarter and automate things so that you can get more done with the same amount of time. So that's next week. That sounds like something that would be valuable to you. And then I'll take questions. If you've got questions, again, throw it up in the chat window of either in the Google Hangout or over there in Zoom. I don't see any questions. So again, thank you for being here. Thanks for being part of this community that we're building, and hope that it was helpful and hope you all have a great weekend. And here's my contact information. If you have questions after this that come up, you can always email me. And again, thanks for being here.